All right, we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. So excited to see you here. Thank you, Brian and Megan, for your reflections in the chat. Great to hear about those spotlights in Garland and Beaumont. That's really, really helpful. So just as a logistical note, a couple of things. One, we may be an intimate group, which will be exciting. We can really dive in and have some great conversation. In the event that we have a larger group, we may move into some breakout rooms. So if you want to be sure that you have video capability, that would be great. Make sure you know how to access your audio. That would also be great. And if you want to go ahead and rename yourself, just so we know where you're coming from, so we can build connections, that will just help us so much. So you can do that by clicking on the participant icon, and then you should see an option if you hover over your name to rename. With that, let's dive in. So hi, everyone. My name is Jenny Johnson, and I am a director with TNTP. I've been with the organization for 6.5 years now, and I am based in Houston, Texas. I do a lot of work across the state right now, especially in supporting 3 TEA grant programs. One being the School Action Fund, as well as supporting and leading some community engagement work with early childhood programs in Houston. Outside of my project work, I have the great fortune of partnering with TNTP leaders like Tim to think through our statewide strategy for community engagement practices. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Jenny. Pleasure to join you today, and thank you all for being here. My name is Tim Heiss. I am a partner at TNTP. I am based in a small town called Burnet, Texas, in the Hill Country, just northwest of Austin. Like Jenny, I currently support several large statewide programs, such as the Resilient School Support Program, School Action Fund, and SSI Community Partnerships, and coordinate our Texas strategy around TNTP. We're currently working with nearly 75 LEAs across the state. And so really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and talk about the connection between authentic stakeholder engagement and portfolio planning.
Awesome, thanks, Tim. Yes, very grateful you all chose to spend about 60 minutes with us, and looking forward to hearing more from you throughout. If you're not familiar with TNTP, we are a national nonprofit organization that supports schools and school systems to prepare students for graduation and success in college, career, and life. We believe that if schools provide excellent teaching every day in every classroom, then student success will skyrocket. But great teaching isn't just about the person at the front of the classroom. We all know this, right? It's also about how the leader in the building is developing the teachers to support students in reaching their goals, as well as how the district or school system creates and nurtures the conditions that support student learning and the well-being of all stakeholders. We believe the key to meaningfully improving the quality of education kids receive is also meaningfully improving the 3 elements of great teaching. That is talent, content, and instruction, and ensuring those improvements can be sustained over time in partnership with families and communities. You heard from Tim and I about some of the work that we do in the fields. And more often than not in that work, we often see a deep focus on traditional forms of engagement, meaning sharing information with communities and families while providing targeted opportunities for feedback. But a large part of our work is also in supporting our partners with building trust with students and families and communities, integrating their feedback into program design, and ultimately creating the conditions for shared decision-making so stakeholder feedback has equal weight in the decision-making process, which includes involving and collaborating with communities more regularly and increasing their agency in the school experience. So for our time together today, we'll explore what exactly we mean by equal weight and authentic engagement and what that looks like in the portfolio planning process. So take 30 seconds to review our session's guiding question here. And as you do that, see others joining us. Welcome, welcome you all. We're just getting started. So glad you're here today. So by the end of our time together, you will have a framework to think about community engagement in a way that makes it concrete and actionable. And during our session, you'll actually get time and space to apply that framework and reflect on where you might want to strengthen community engagement as a part of your portfolio planning process. With anything, I think it's important that we have a shared language to really ground ourselves in. So I want to name that for TNTP, authentic community engagement to us means building ongoing and trusting relationships that bridge the gap between the classroom and the community. This means that in order to practice authentic engagement, we must deeply listen first. And we also know that this level of collaboration and partnership requires both careful planning and intentional action. As you consider what authentic engagement looks like in practice today, we also want you to think more globally about how you improve the lives of students. As you all know, you all can do a whole lot on your own to make progress towards a major initiative. But when you add the power of thousands of students, families, teachers, principals, central office staff, the list goes on, right? Including civic organizations, businesses, funders, and donors, so much more is possible. Megan and Brian, they kicked us off with sharing those great examples of what that looks like in action. And to me, this seems especially important to the SGS strategy of taking bold action to create and expand great options. Speaking of the SGS strategy, I'm really excited to talk to you all today about community engagement because it's a critical part of the portfolio planning process. Ultimately, the SGS strategy itself is a problem-solving approach to understand school performance and community demand to deliver the schools families want and need in their communities. So community input is a critical form of data and really understanding what that demand is. With that in mind, Tim and I wanted to share TNTP's framework for authentic community engagement with you all to think about that community input and how it takes shape. So our framework includes 4 key pillars. The first is shared vision and accountability, which ultimately means developing a commonly held vision for student success that is both rigorous and relevant, and then ensuring that everyone from students to families to school staff understand the role that they have in achieving that vision. The second is authentic collaboration, investing in families' decision-making authority and providing them the resources to make key decisions to shape the experiences of students. The third is intentional culture and diversity, which means creating a culture of inclusion by addressing implicit bias, being purposely reflective of the community's demographics, and encouraging the sharing of diverse perspectives, talents, and ideas. And then last but not least is 360-degree communication. So prioritizing ongoing communication and transparency, creating meaningful opportunities for all voices to be heard, and developing a strong feedback loop. So we'll actually spend much of the remainder of our session reflecting on all 4 of these pillars in detail, but I wanted to provide you with a quick overview as we reflect on what this looks like in action with another SGS district right now. So as we watch this video from Edgewood ISD, I want you to consider the following. In what ways is the district vision informed by the broader context of the community in which it serves? And then when you think back to those 4 pillars that I just shared, which of them is Edgewood ISD leveraging to form partnerships and engage with key stakeholders? So I will ask if you all are willing, maybe for two brave souls to come off mute and share their reflections after we share this or watch this around 2-minute and 40-second video clip. And let me know if you can't hear the sound.
Edgewood ISD is a school district on the west side of San Antonio. We've been serving students over 50 years. The west side is one of the more poverty-driven areas, but I don't see that as a challenge. I see that as an opportunity to serve young men and women who give us a sense as educators of how do we disrupt poverty? How do we give them access to opportunities that perhaps they may not have? Vision 2025 is all about creating platforms in our 16 square miles, so that when our students move on beyond the 16, as we call it, they are able to go and find the livable wages that we all work for as adults. So we want to create these 5 zones: a STEAM innovation zone, an early childhood innovation zone, a zone around leadership development, a zone around public service, and then a performing arts zone, where our students can say, I would like to attend school in an area that matches the special gifts that I have as a student. And as parents, that we are able to educate our parents so that they're able to broker the system and find the schools that best, again, suit the needs of their students. So for us, we are at the beginning of establishing those zones, but that's going to require partners. We are beginning to engage in Senate Bill 1882 partnerships with nonprofit groups such as Pre-K for Essay. The second one that's very exciting and promising is the one that we've just engaged with Texas A&M University and our Gus Garcia University School. That is going to allow us to provide high quality learning for our students in our middle grades. For those of you that are in the business community, we need your expertise. We are trying to develop the workforce of the future. We can't do that alone. So I would ask you to consider partnering with us, engaging in a conversation around how do we create opportunities for students while they're in the K-12 system, so that eventually these students can move on and become your employees. The work that is coming to us in the next 20 years, just in terms of increases in population and the type of individuals that are coming and the type of work that exists and the work that we don't even know is going to exist, all rests on school districts such as Edgewood and providing a high quality education. So this is why we have to think outside of our boundaries. This is why we ask of you, come join us, come be part of the effort, bring the expertise that you have and help us educate students in a way that it will have an impact on them beyond just their time in school, but also the journey of their family. That is collective impact at its finest.
Awesome. So I know a quick video like this won't tell us everything we need to know, right, about Edgewood and the strategies they're using and what authentic engagement means for them, how that shows up. But would love, again, to hear from two folks, if you wouldn't mind just coming off mute. What do you notice about their approach and maybe how those 4 pillars might come to life and how they really expand options for students within the district?
Hey, Brian here. I'm happy to jump in. Really like that video. And I like that. I think when you think of the pillars, certainly a shared vision, and it's here's what we're trying to do for our students and really painting that optimistic view. And touches a bit on the third pillar, intentional culture and diversity. Maybe it's a little bit of a different way, but where they talked about like the unique gifts of all their students and how they're trying to have these different pathways, knowing different students' interests. So certainly see the pillars showing up in a few different ways, even in just a short video.
Yeah, really appreciate that, Brian. Thank you so much. Anybody else want to add on to that or notice anything different? I think I'll just name one thing that was really interesting for me from the video was sort of the mention of like the business community and really their partnership and making sure that we really provide this like pipeline of experiences for students, right? Both through their PK-12 experience, but also thinking about them, you know, becoming young adults and, you know, citizens and, you know, workers within that community, what it really looks like to prepare them for the long term. So really thinking about intentional culture and diversity, about who's at the table and what that looks like. Okay, great. Well, now we're going to get into the good stuff, the nitty gritty. So with that, I am going to pass it off to Tim for us to do a deeper dive into the 4 pillars and actually give you all a chance to reflect on how they might show up within each of your contexts.
Thanks, Jenny. Appreciate that. As Jenny shared, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of the 4 pillars of authentic stakeholder engagement that Jenny shared an overview of just a moment ago. And as we go through each pillar, we're going to, add to the definition by actually putting forward an ideal state about what might be true in your district, your systems you work with, if that pillar is fully lived into in the SGS portfolio planning process. That's what we're zooming in on today. Within each pillar, we're also going to talk about some critical shifts or, an evolution of thinking about how our practices may need to be tweaked or evolved to make living into that pillar a reality. And then after we do that, we're going to pause for some live polling and reflection as well, and ask each of you to reflect either on the system you're a part of or the system that you support, to think about what strengths exist with regard to that pillar in the portfolio planning process, and what areas of opportunity may exist as well, through some structured self-reflection questions. And so we'll have the same sort of routine or structure to each pillar. But to jump in and model that, we're going to dive right into the first pillar, which is, as Jenny named, is shared vision. And if this pillar is lived into and realized as part of the portfolio planning process, then selected school actions, improvements, and strategies are all going to be rooted in a common shared vision for student success that is both developed and then ultimately selected alongside families and the broader community and the many stakeholders that Jenny mentioned a moment ago. I feel like this is one shift or one pillar that many folks have talked about before, particularly that first statement, where we learned over time that transformation done to communities is not effective and not well received. The shift here is to lead change in partnership with communities, set priorities, ground in that shared vision of the reality that you're seeking together, and engage in a partnership to drive toward that vision. The other piece of this pillar, though, that feels important and sometimes we lop off is that shared vision also comes with shared accountability. And when you are developing that vision in partnership, sole accountability for success doesn't lie with just one entity, does not lie just with the district. It actually rests with that broader stakeholder group. And as Jenny said, that power of that broader network is so much stronger, and accountability lies with that group as well. And where there's shared accountability, there is often collaboration and concerted effort to meet the goals that you've set. So if pillar 1, shared vision, is lived into, you see that decision-making power and that leadership around vision begin to shift, not just rest solely with the district and its leaders, but actually there are meaningful opportunities for students, families, and the broader community to define and ultimately shape the student experience in the system. So with that, we're gonna have our first moment to pause and ask you to reflect on either your system that you're in or a system that you support in terms of strengths and opportunities with regard to this shared vision pillar. Jenny just dropped a link into the chat box, which you can click. It will take you to a Poll Everywhere site. It will first prompt you to enter your name, which you can just drop in your first name and proceed. But we ask you to select the statements that are both strengths and areas of opportunity on that pillar as you reflect independently for a moment, and we'll produce sort of a collective map here of where our collective strengths and opportunities lie with regard to pillar 1. So I'll pause for a moment. Jenny, any other instructions for the poll?
You got it.
All right, that link is in the chat box. We'll pause for a moment, one silent moment, and allow you to reflect on that. And you should see responses begin to come in on the screen ahead of you, on the screen right now, as you begin to respond. I should say, and I think you all probably realize this, you can select more than one strength and more than one opportunity. So please feel free to select as many as apply in that screen. As responses roll in here, that's great. So far, we see that this pillar may be a relative strength for the systems that are represented in this room here. Lots of current strengths lifted up. So far, a few, at least one area of opportunity there. But this is collectively in this group, this shared vision and accountability may be a collective strength where there are lots of things already in place in the portfolio planning process with regard to this pillar. We're going to leave this poll open because you're going to come back to it in a moment. There'll be a new set of reflection questions after we dive into the second pillar. But you can leave that tab open. We'll come back to it in just a moment. Thanks, Jenny. Remember, one of our goals today is to provide you with sort of a framework or a structure to think concretely about stakeholder engagement. Our first pillar was shared vision. The second pillar is authentic collaboration. And when this is done well in the SGS portfolio planning process, families and the community have decision-making authority alongside the district in the portfolio planning process. The shift here is a movement from informing decision-making in the district to actually having that seat at the table. We all know and have seen the data about the average lifespan of a superintendent in a district, not actually lifespan, but their tenure in the district, I should say. How long principals last, teachers last in the districts. It's families, it's students who are there the longest, and they're they need and deserve a seat at the decision-making table to inform the school system and the choices that are being made that affect them and their families. And so the key shift here in authentic collaboration is not just that you are informing or notifying or occasionally seeking input from stakeholders, but actually giving them a seat at the decision-making table to make those important critical decisions around district-wide strategy. Some of the shifts required here in terms of practice are a movement from what we might call negative mindsets about families and communities, either willingness or ability to have a perspective and be engaged in this type of discussion and decision making, to more of a belief, an asset-oriented belief around what families know, bring, and are able to contribute to the strategy that you are pursuing in your system. So moving from that negative mindset to more of one that is asset-oriented and a shared belief that families and communities and stakeholders are critical for the success of the initiative. In addition, saying that and believing that are important, but they actually have to be coupled with meaningful opportunities to have that input and to make those decisions. So moving from interactions that are transactional or perfunctory or prescribed to actually really meaningful open forums and opportunities for families, for community members, for stakeholders to engage with data, to engage with learning, and ultimately to have a say in the decisions that are being made as you collaborate with stakeholders to make and set your SGS strategy and implement those actions that are selected. And so with that, you can flip back to the tab with the poll that you had open. We can drop the link one more time into the chat. I see at least one more person has joined us since the last poll. But we're going to ask you to go again to the poll and reflect on strengths and opportunities with regard to authentic collaboration. There are several reflection statements and questions there. Please again select all that apply for your system or a system you support with regard to authentic collaboration. Seeing responses roll in here too, it seems like there might be some more opportunities, different from the shared vision pillar that we looked at a second ago, some more opportunities around authentic collaboration. And this really is a shift. It's a movement from informing and involving to actually collaborating with and allowing families and stakeholders to have a seat at that decision-making table. So I'm not surprised there's some more opportunities on this slide, on this pillar for us to reflect on and think about as we move into the next phase of our discussion here in just a moment. But let's keep moving to dive a little bit more deeply into the third pillar that we are talking about today. And again, please leave your poll slide open. We'll have a new reflection sheet to pop up in just a moment. But our third pillar that we want to discuss and dive into to put some more meat on the bones today is intentional culture and diversity. When this pillar is lived into, in your SGS portfolio planning process, several things are true. Selected school actions, improvements, and strategies, as well as the processes to select them, intentionally disrupt systemic oppression by interrogating the experience of students and families across lines of difference. That's a big, bold statement, but ultimately to deliver on the schools that families and communities want and need, this is the work. This is the work, and it requires intentional efforts and strategy on the part of the district planning team to think about how to weave diversity, equity, and inclusion into the SGS process. If this pillar is represented in your portfolio planning process, there are a couple of shifts that are undertaken. Oftentimes, we seek to avoid or circumvent conversations around bias or inequities. But actually, if this pillar is lived into, those conversations are welcomed and planned for, and an authentic part of the SGS portfolio planning process. There is a level of comfort, as uncomfortable often as those conversations can be, there's a level of comfort in knowing that they will be had, and they are part of the portfolio planning process. In addition, data in the process is interrogated across numerous lines of difference, not just racial lines of difference, but linguistic lines of difference, economic lines of difference, all sorts of demographic lines of difference that are important for us to unpack information across to inform our strategy. And in addition, there's an intentional effort to ensure that there is representation of the community that is being served and worked with in the leadership and the governing body and the deciding body. And so people see themselves or representations of themselves in the team that is leading the work, and they themselves and their peers are also representative of the broader community, those folks that are at the decision-making table and leading the SGS portfolio planning process. And so with that, thinking about these key shifts here, again, there's a reinforcement that we are shifting from deficit-based thinking about the community and about stakeholders to actually taking a strengths-based approach and thinking about the assets, not just of the community, but of the individuals who are in that community. And then there are some more tactical things that need to be true if this shift is lived, if this pillar is lived into. And we know that it's important that we communicate with all of our stakeholders in a language that is accessible to them. And so one tactical shift is moving from communication in one or sometimes even two languages to languages that are actually fully represented of the community that are being served and impacted. So with that, Jenny's going to shift us one more time into a reflection on this pillar. You can flip back to that tab with the poll and begin to log strengths and opportunities statements that are true about your system or systems that you work with regard to intentional culture and diversity. Right, a few more responses rolling in. Once again, I see some more opportunities with regard to intentional culture and diversity, this particular pillar around authentic stakeholder engagement. Something for us to dive into more deeply around the barriers and the tools and strategies that may support moving toward more intentional culture and diversity and engagement efforts in portfolio planning going forward. With that, we will turn one last time to our final pillar to share the ideal state as well as some of the critical shifts that underlie that ideal state before we dive into a deeper discussion about these pillars with the group here with us today. As Jenny mentioned, the fourth pillar is 360-degree communication. There are a couple of things that are true or that will be true if this pillar is lived into in the SGS portfolio planning process. That is that the process will be transparent and all stakeholders have the opportunity to contribute to and learn about SGS decisions. I think this can also be sort of spoken about or defined as there being two key components. There is two-way communication in the SGS portfolio planning process, an opportunity for stakeholders to both give and receive input, feedback, and information. But also too, the second component is that there is a feedback loop, a healthy feedback loop, whereby when communication is shared, when input is gathered, when decisions are made, there's a closing of that loop. There's a full circle to recognize and respond to the communication from the input that was given or received from stakeholders, so that it's communicated that it informed your decision and that it is valued going forward. So there's two-way communication, but also that it's looped back around to in that 360-degree manner. Feel important to lift up when we're talking about this pillar of authentic stakeholder engagement. Some of the shifts that are undertaken when moving toward 360-degree communication are that you move from a sort of reactive or hastily planned communications or public engagement strategy, and actually you have a more thoughtful, intentional, prior or pre-built out stakeholder engagement and communication plan that involves all stakeholders. Often we lead with this as part of the portfolio planning process, and we think about this early on, but we fail to fully live into it or keep that stakeholder engagement plan alive throughout the process. And so this is being intentional about setting those moments to both collect and communicate data, but also to circle back and communicate how that input and data informed ultimate decision making. Additionally, instead of limited or anecdotal information about stakeholder participation, there's a regular use of family, teacher, student, community surveys to track stakeholder engagement, stakeholder perspective, and that information is shared transparently and publicly as part of the portfolio planning process and the ongoing progress monitoring process. So for this last pillar, we're going to pause and reflect one last time. Again, you can go back to your poll tab and respond, clicking the strengths and areas of opportunity with regard to 360-degree communication. All right. Once again, here, I think we see sort of a smattering of strengths and opportunities with regard to the fourth pillar, 360-degree communication, which is fine, which is good. We want to see those strengths and share and learn from those, and it's okay to recognize those areas of opportunity. As we sort of wrap up talking about each of these four pillars in a bit more detail and asking you to reflect on your system's progress toward living into them, we're going to move ahead to think about maybe some of the barriers that exist right now in living into these four pillars, but also some of the tools, resources, and examples that are available, protocols to help live more authentically into these four pillars. We had thought about going into breakout groups, but given the size of our team here today, I think we might stay whole group. And I'll pass the mic back over to Jenny to sort of facilitate this conversation here in the room together today, to move beyond sort of the self-assessment toward, where do we go from here, and what tools, what systems are available to sort of navigate around the barriers that might be in place. Jenny?
Thanks so much, Tim. So really appreciate you all engaging in that activity and reflecting honestly about where your districts may be. I think a few things that stand out to me, if we can actually go back to a few of our responses here, is we saw some differences, especially when we think about authentic collaboration, maybe some barriers to how do we really collaborate beyond getting feedback directly from stakeholders? How do we involve them in our design efforts? When it comes to intentional cultural and diversity, really sort of leaning into dismantling those systemic inequities, and also not necessarily glossing over those things, really unpacking those historical dynamics and how they may impact relationships. And then a lot of different things when it comes to 360 communication. So as we review that, again, would love for you to either come off mute or add in the chat. First, what do you think are some of the barriers to getting closer to some of those ideal shifts with the four pillars? And then what are some solutions that you're thinking about right now? Give you a couple of minutes, either come off mute or add some thoughts in chat.
Jenny, I dropped this in the chat, but I'm actually wondering, I think even in the poll, these different metrics I know for the SGS team, like to have it on a cyclical basis where we're doing this kind of self-assessment, I found that really helpful. And I'm wondering if that's a resource that TNTP has available, because I would actually come back and revisit that self-assessment tool because it's so clearly defined. It's so clearly for me defined pathways to action and pathways to growth.
Yeah, this is actually a tool that I use with some of the districts that I work with right now. So yes, it is a tool that we can share. I've actually uploaded it to our session within Excel events. So if you all just go back to the session, click on it, you should see the embedded documents there. This tool, self-assessment tool, as well as our deck for today. I think one other thing on my mind related to this is many of you shared, strengths, things that are going well in terms of your community and stakeholder engagement. So any bright spots or lessons learned, best practices that you want to offer up to the group? I'm sure your colleagues would appreciate it. So anything you sort of want to spotlight for your district?
Jenny, this is Darrington Ramsey. I'm from the Edgewood County ISD Executive Director. I don't have a bright spot because this is my first day, as I'm sure there are bright spots here, but just in general, and this wouldn't be a barrier that's necessarily happening here at Edgewood County, because again, this is my first day. But I think one of the barriers might be simply the mindset. The mindset where we as professional educators are seeing ourselves and delivering in a manner that values those who aren't professional educators on our same level, or even beyond that, in a way that our engagement sort of honors and centers them, as opposed to them being sort of the receivers of our knowledge, our experience, and our expertise. And I know that many professional educators are moving beyond that, but I think traditionally that mindset is something that in many organizations, or that kind of culture may be something that needs to be overcome. And so the next steps in doing that potentially would be simply acknowledging it, having the opportunity to sit down and acknowledge that there's a culture of we are the experts. It's almost like in the classroom, sort of sage on the stage, right, versus guide on the side way of thinking, if we use some of our sort of pedagogical lenses in thinking about that. So I think the next steps in being that, again, would be sort of acknowledging that and having the opportunity to dialogue around it, as opposed to just assuming that if I tell you you should center people, that somehow your beliefs, assumptions, and mindsets just sort of come along with that, as opposed to needing to develop the capacity to even think in that manner.
Absolutely. Well, happy first day. What a way to dive in, but absolutely really appreciate that reflection. And for me, that feels spot on, right? Like really unpacking our mindsets and our beliefs, not only about, what we may believe outside of like professional educators, but also maybe what we may believe about like certain groups of people, right? So what are the messages that we have been socialized to believe based on our own identities, our own experiences? And to your point, really unpacking that with our colleagues, talking about it, lifting it up, and then mitigating it, right? Because I think we all believe in practice that it's valuable. Tim, I know you think a lot about this too. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, the only thing, well, yes, the thing I would add is that, mindsets, I think definitely are an important component, particularly important barrier to authentic collaboration, right? This belief that we as professional educators are the experts and have the knowledge to make decisions on behalf of others, and those not in our profession don't have that knowledge. And I think, what I've learned from studying mindsets are you can't buy a program to shift them. You can't flip a switch, and you can't train mindsets away. Mindsets change with repeated exposure to an alternative truth. And so it's important for system leaders to shine a light on other mindsets and other ways of doing business that do lean into authentic collaboration and that do value the assets and the contributions of families in the broader community, to shift that sort of mindset over time. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, if there aren't any additional reflections, we're coming up on time here. So really want to create just one last space for you all to reflect individually. I know for me, I get to conferences, I'm so excited because it's just space to build community with folks who are doing awesome work, think through big ideas, and then, it's the day after the conference, and then I just get back into work. And then I'm like, oh no, like, what about all those big ideas, right? So just want to give you some space to think about and name at least one commitment maybe you want to make today. To Megan's earlier point, maybe it's well, you want to do the self-assessment with your whole team, right? To identify maybe additional places where you want to improve your stakeholder engagement in your portfolio cleaning process. Maybe it's something else. So name that commitment you're making today, why you're choosing it, and then what steps you'll take to live out that commitment and determine what impact you hope that it will make. So I'll give you all just 1 minute personal reflection if you want to pull out paper or whatever to do some reflecting. And then we'll come back and close out. All right, so as we started, just want to close out with gratitude. Thanks for you all for spending some time with us. Really appreciated hearing the things that you're thinking about, the things that are going well. Also really appreciate your candid reflections and maybe opportunities to reconsider things. And we'd love to keep the conversation going. So Tim and our contact information is here if you just want to reach out to us directly. It's awesome to see some of our current partners join us today. Always good to see familiar faces and names. Or if you're within Excel events, if you just go on your left-hand toolbar and you click on Strategic Advisors, you can find out more information about TNTP that way. But always love partnering with our district partners, especially in communities, to really sustain our initiatives. The last thing I'll add is, in addition to the self-assessment that I added to our session today, you also have a copy of this deck. So the links at the bottom here around our COVID-19 school response toolkit, as well as our Walking Together Hub, which both include community engagement resources, you have direct access to that. If I didn't miss anything, we so appreciate your time and hope you have a great end to Summit.
Jenny, before you all go, can I ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
So this is Darrington Ramsey again. I'm wondering, some of the language that is shared in some of the documents, while I agree with the language, I know that language potentially on the diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, liberation sort of journey potentially becomes a minefield for educators who's trying to deliver on that for students, teachers, communities. And that isn't to say that they should not engage in that journey, because the work is absolute and thus we must do it. But sort of being able to engage sort of the readiness of your context with the intention of moving directly to that language and the ideas and the concepts and the research that's behind it, absolutely. I'm just wondering, are there tools, and you mentioned the needs assessment or the school assessment or self-assessment, does that tool sort of address the readiness level of a particular organization or in their personnel to begin having those kinds of conversations? I kind of think of sort of the larger things that are going on in our society around language and all those kinds of things, and how misinformation potentially is influencing that community context, even the parental context, student and teacher even. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about that? And how might educators think about approaching that as a way of being more productive than not to the extent that we're trying to avoid sort of discomfort and those sorts of things, but as a way of being more intentional and deliberate in our work?
So glad you asked the question. Let me just name outright that, as an organization, TNTP has sort of been on our own diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. And with that, we are starting to do more work alongside of our partners in engaging in these conversations, because we think that it is key to, again, dismantling systemic oppression, right? I know some in certain instances, you can't just say that directly outright. It might shut down the conversation. But just in terms of, so you have a sense of our orientation to the work. With that said, I do think that there's sort of like a cadence or a starting place in which you want to start with educators. And I think first and foremost, it's really starting with like your own self-work, really identifying sort of your internalized beliefs, your identity and how that shows up in your work. And then really just get comfortable with having those conversations with your colleagues, right? Because sometimes we like work in environments where that is not the case. So we really want to build that culture. And then from there, that sort of starts to open up the avenues for us to talk about how that impacts our work with students, right? So I think there are some TNTP resources that we could probably share. If you want to follow up or drop in your email in the chat, I can definitely do some digging or some asking. Tim, I don't know if you have any other thoughts, but I just appreciate the question.
I do have one just quick thought to add on, and I think, honestly, I think this is not a silver bullet or a tool, but it's the thing that I think has to be in place for people to be ready, for a system to be ready to move into those conversations, and it's leadership investment and their willingness to step into those conversations. The superintendent, the cabinet, the leadership of the system, if they are invested and willing, they can chart the path and also, you know, save space and be as comfortable as possible in opening up that sort of like box, that Pandora's box that can sometimes surface afterwards. But not a tool, not a resource, but I'd assess leadership's willingness and investment in having those conversations and doing that work as a way of assessing readiness.
Thank you, Jenny and Tim. I really appreciate your responses. Have a blessed day.
Thank you, everyone.